name is Ryan Southwick. I'm a science fiction author. Enigma is a science fantasy story set 10,000 years in the future around the Lost Colonies. And so the concept is that humanity has fled Earth and colonized the stars, and they've been basically isolated for 10,000 years, and the story takes place just after they've begun to reconnect. The protagonist is actually an ambassador to the Lost Colonies Alliance, so she's like right in the middle of it. The story itself, it has elements of science fiction space opera. So there's ends up being two different plot lines. One plot line is really kind of like a space opera, so the characters are taking off across through space, and the other is more of a fantasy. So the protagonist ends up getting stuck on this medieval world, and it almost becomes like a survival book where she has to be very creative with the very few resources that she has, but it's more of like a fantasy setting. So there are some strange and dangerous creatures and some mystical kind of weird things going on that she has to figure out. Readers can really expect like a riches to rags type story, because the protagonist is very well off. It does also have some like Lord of the Rings flavors, where there's kind of this epic quest that she's going on, kind of against the odds, and kind of like, you know, almost like forming a party to accomplish this impossible mission. Enigma was inspired. I just had this flash of a scene in my mind. That's how most books come to me. It starts with just like one scene, and then the entire plot and all that stuff builds around it. And in this case, I had imagined this kind of this well-off girl from a futuristic society who just gets, who is used to relying on, her wealth, her family name, her title, and all this stuff, and she's, in one of those people she's entitled, and she doesn't even know she's entitled, right? She's been so immersed in that she can't even see the problems that she has, until she gets stuck in a place where she has none of that, like not even the technology that she's come to rely on. Nobody knows who she is, stuff like that. And in this case, she can't even speak. So like her most powerful weapon, being an ambassador, is her voice, and she doesn't even have that. Trying to imagine, like, gosh, what would that look like, especially in a rustic setting. And really, like, the rest of the book came from that. So I was like, okay, what would, if that was true, what would the rest of the universe look like? And I just started building it out and out. Okay, what about that world? What about the worlds of it? What world does she come from? What are the other worlds in the Lost Colonies Alliance? And that's kind of how it built up. As far as real life influence, the one, I'm not even sure I realized I was doing it at the time, but the protagonist comes across an inn named Penance, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, and it's just this rustic, made of wood, like no patrons, it's very very quaint, and it's unlike, of course, for her, it's unlike anything she's ever seen. And she walks in, and it's kind of this sensory experience for her as well. She sees the hearth, she can smell the wood, coming from a planet where they don't burn wood, right? So it's very unique to her. And then, the soap in the back, and the alcohol from the bar, from a character who doesn't drink, and just foreign alcohols and stuff like that. And so for her, it kind of creates this nostalgic experience. It very quickly becomes like her favorite place in the universe to be. Like, that's the only place she wants to be, because it's so warm and welcoming and so unique. And she meets all these wonderful characters there. And it actually reflects a hotel that I worked at when I was 15 years old in England. I worked there for a summer, and I remember, I just remember walking in, and again, it was like nothing I had ever seen or experienced before, like the smells, the sights, the people. It was also like the first time I'd really been away from home and parents and stuff like that. It was really like, so combined with like the first taste of true independence, which I think the character experience as well. It's also the hotel where I met my wife. And so kind of putting that on paper, I think, was cathartic for me. One theme is the rags to riches, or riches to rags in this case. So Britta has a crutch, even though she doesn't know it, on her wealth and her family name. And so, but the theme, it's less about kind of the riches to rags and kind of like, oh, you know, showing the rich girl what real life is like. More about, you know, the protagonist has a really indomitable spirit, right? So it's like, even when confronted with these truths, one of the themes is how do humans in general kind of rise to the occasion when necessary, right? So she's had all these things taken away from her, but she doesn't crumble, right? You know, she finds ways to deal with it, and it's not easy, but it shows her perseverance. And I think, so for me, I'd like to think that's a reflection on humanity, right? The second one is the Lost Colonies themselves. So you have these colonies that have been isolated for 10,000 years, and so they've evolved. Their societies have evolved in different directions. Their philosophies, the things that they value, are very, very, very different. You know, over the 10,000 years, and so. So another of the themes in the book is kind of a reconciliation between these different philosophies and how they come together and how it can be done maybe constructively. And in this case, like with the protagonist's help, because I see a lot of those reflections in today. Especially in the United States, there's a lot of polarizing topics out there that are dividing folks. And so maybe to me, Enigma is a story of hope for the future. So I started the building Enigma, or I want to say like the universe of Enigma, started with the planet itself. So it's an alien planet that has some kind of very strange properties that I won't go into so I don't spoil the book, but trying to imagine, okay, how would that affect the world? How would that affect the plants and the animals that have that evolved on that planet? How would it affect the people that settled there? Their appearance, you know, their behaviors, their speech patterns, things like that, as well as their everyday life. And so taking that information, I captured it in what I call a world Bible. And so it's a central document repository where I capture every piece of information I can imagine about the universe that I think is important. So if I'm building a planet, it could be, you know, hey, what's the gravity compared to Earth? What's the rotation time? You know, cloudiness, you know, rain, all that stuff. But also, you know, the society, what's the culture like? Do they have any idioms? What are their holidays? What, you know, that they celebrate that we, you know, wouldn't even think about today based on their history? What is their history? How did they get to where they are? And so I really kind of started focusing on Enigma because most of the book takes place actually on the planet itself. But then I did basically went through the same exercise for each of the 4 colonies. Even though in this book you don't really see any of the colonies, in order for the characters to feel authentic, I really wanted to build out as much information as I could about each of the colonies. What are their core philosophies? What makes them different from each other? Weather systems, distance from each other, things like that. And so different types of governments. The Lost Colonies has a variety of not only different characters, but the colonies themselves are like characters. And so I spent probably 2 months capturing all of that information and putting it into the World Bible. Probably about 50 pages worth of source material before I started writing. One challenge actually was keeping them different from each other. It's too easy to go like down a Star Trek route and just start picking on the Klingons and things like that. So so one of the challenges was I think starting with a stereotype can be very helpful, but then adding the little bits of flavor and things like that make them different enough that somebody doesn't feel like they've read this book before, And the second was, this is the universe has a larger scope than anything I've tried to tackle before. So I've done world building before in one of my previous series, but it was only for one world, and it was really just kind of a different version of Earth. This was 5 different planets, and none of them were Earth. Also trying to imagine it, imagine the world 10,000 years in the future and how each of those would have evolved differently, and keeping track of all of it. Not only how the colonies would interplay in an interesting way, but meshing that with the personalities that are coming from those planets and their different motivations and goals and things like that. Keeping track of all of that was a real challenge. My favorite part of the story is definitely the protagonist. Britta Silverstar she comes from the wealthiest family on her home planet. They own Silverstar Corporation, which is the company that developed faster than light travel, and they only discovered it 12 years prior to when the story starts. And that's when they started discovering the other colonies. But that's given her a station of utmost privilege. She's also the eldest child, so she's heir to the entire legacy. And so she grew up very privileged. But I think what makes her very unique in there as well is, even though she suffers in a lot of ways from being entitled and having some of that privilege, she also has a lot of ambition and a really great spirit. And so she's been very determined throughout her life to not rely on her privilege. And so she's an ambassador in the story. So she's an ambassador for her planet to the Lost Colonies Alliance. And she's the youngest ambassador in history. She's 28 years old in the story. And she worked very hard to get there. And so I think what I love about her is just her perseverance. And she's also, there's of course, I think, a little bit of self-delusion in there. She's convinced herself that she earned every ounce of it, and none of it has to do with her family name or her title or anything like that. And it's, ask anybody else, they'll probably say it's not true. But I think one of the fun parts about her character arc is her getting to discover whether, what parts of that are true and what parts aren't, because she gets stuck in some situations where she's confronted with that, and there's no two ways around it. So she really gets to discover where she shines. And so I think the thing that I love most about her is the challenges that she goes through in the book because of the more like the survival part of it. The challenge that she has to rise to and how she rises to them, especially given the background that she's come from. Sometimes when I reread the book, I feel inspired when I see how she survives. My favorite part, there's a sequence where the protagonist is essentially she's trapped in a pod and she's dropping to the planet, and there's the entire sequence from how she gets into that pod to not dying, and basically the end of the sequence spans 3 chapters, and it's 3 chapters of just flowing, nonstop, heart-pounding, one thing after another. And I think when I got to the end of it, I couldn't believe how much I actually wrote, and I was just so happy with how well it flowed. I think that is probably all of the things that happened, and the very just incredibly creative ways that she got around it, I think are probably my favorite part of the book. One of the boundary pushing things here is the Lost Colonies Alliance itself. I think the universe and the scope is very ambitious, and the way that it ties things together, very, very large and important issues, but still saying very, very personal and making it a very personal story, and still having really kind of that Lord of the Rings feeling in a way. I think makes it is really what makes it unique in my mind. Enigma, I think it's my 12th. It's the 12th book I've written. So Enigma started with a flash of inspiration, like a scene that I had imagined, and it was so powerful that I think like that day I sat down and I actually wrote a chapter, probably from somewhere like a third of the way through the book, right? Because that's the one that came to me, and I wrote out the entire chapter, and I liked it. It really resonated as much as I'd hoped, and so I then started thinking more about the characters. Okay, who exactly is this person, Britta? And usually what I do is for each character I have a dossier that has their, almost like a role-playing character sheet of their stats, their height, their weight, their personality, their quirks, their skills, their all of that stuff. And so it was kind of imagining her, imagining more about the planets. I started basically creating the world Bible, starting with the plot. So, okay, here's the scene, which is wonderful, but like, how did she get there? Where's that going? Where is this story going to end? And so I'm halfway between what they call a plotter and a pantser. So plotter is somebody who very meticulously goes through and plots everything. A pantser is somebody who they don't plot anything. They just basically start writing and let the story go where it will. I do something in between. So I did a very light plot outline for the book, and once that was done, that kind of told me, okay, what characters need to be involved, how many different colonies are there going to be, and so that allowed me to start exploring the planets, start fleshing out some of the other characters, adding them to the world Bible, and then once I had that information, that's when I start with I consider the first draft is ready to start, and With my first book, I jumped around a little bit. I would write, something from kind of toward the end of the book, something toward the beginning, basically whatever kind of struck me. But I've landed on really just kind of starting with chapter 1. Once I've got the outline, I find that's enough to get me going. It's enough guidance to start the story. And so, just really started with chapter 1. My process, almost invariably, I get halfway through the book, I reconcile where the story is with where the outline says it's supposed to be going, and I end up having to erase most of it and start over. So what I'll do is I'll actually just scrap whatever doesn't fit, and I'll end up just replotting the end of the book, and then I'll do that again about 3/4 of the way through, and usually again just right at the end to make sure that the finale really sticks with the rest of the book, and so I'm not marrying myself too closely to the plot or to the outline, and then so once the first draft is done, I like to let it sit for a couple of months. I run it by an alpha reader who in this case is also my mother, just getting some feedback on plot, pacing, characters, is it interesting, things like that. And then after it's sat for a while, I'll do a second draft, usually tackling some of the bigger issues that I missed during the first draft. Then I have a couple of beta readers that I trust, so at that point I might give it another round of polish before I send it off to the beta readers, get feedback from them, and then usually that takes a month or two. Once I have the feedback from them, I consolidate it into one place, and then I'll go back, I'll do yet another draft, incorporating all of those changes, and then I export it to Microsoft Word. I go through an exhaustive spelling and grammar check, and then I actually have the computer read the manuscript to me, and to me that's kind of like the final stage of polish, because I can hear what sentences don't flow. Oftentimes, doesn't matter how many times I read something, there are missing words and there are missing articles. I'm famous for missing an or a the or something like that because my eyes just skip over it. But when the computer reads it to you, you can really hear what's wrong. And so usually that's my final level of polish before it goes out to my advanced reader copy team. The interesting thing about the story for me, I've never written something so far in the future, so advanced. They're going to have technologies and things that I probably can't even imagine, right? That nobody today can imagine. There are going to be discoveries between now and then. They're going to probably change what we think about physics and all that. But that being said, I think, there's only so much that you can predict. And so what I try to do is, number one, try to imagine maybe what some of those really crazy and cool things could be, and add them to the story. But instead of just throwing them in there, I really try to imagine, okay, what are, based on some of the things that we know today, and about physics and the universe and all that, and to even like technologies that we have today, what would make that possible? Right, so it doesn't feel like completely far-fetched magic, even though maybe that's where we'll be 10,000 years in the future. So when I'm writing this story, I have all of those facts in mind, so that hopefully the world still comes across as fantastical and advanced, but still grounded for the reader. There are 3 big ones for sure. So I'm a huge George R.R. Martin fan. When I first read the first book of Game of Thrones, I remember being absolutely floored, because I grew up as a fantasy fan, and just dragons and magic, and really that's what I loved. But when I read Game of Thrones, I was taken aback when he introduced dragons, because he had created a set of characters and a plot that was so entrancing. I almost forgot I was reading fantasy. I forgot that there was no magic. He hadn't introduced anything like that. But the story was so enthralling that when he introduced dragons, I was actually disappointed. I'm like, why? You don't need it. This is fantastic, right? And what I took away from that is start with the characters and the plot. Make that interesting. The rest becomes supporting material. So the world, the science fiction, the advanced science, the magic, the, whatever you introduce, make those supporting elements of the story. Don't make them the story itself. And so when I was writing Enigma, I tried to do exactly that. I started by imagining the characters and their challenges and their conflicts, and really what are they trying to accomplish and stuff like that. And then I built the world around that, and that's how I tried to tell the stories, really from the character's perspective, and the rest of it just being backdrop to support that and add flavor. The second author is James S.A. Corey, which is actually a pair of authors who wrote Leviathan Wakes, which is the TV series, what the TV series The Expanse was based off of. And for me, I'm not typically a hard science fiction fan. So you start getting into too many details and too much technology, and you've lost me. I want to know about the characters. I want to know about the relationship. I want to see the plot move forward. And it was one of the first science fiction stories I'd read that really managed to be hard science fiction in a lot of ways, because it's kind of the near future where humanity is traveling throughout the solar system. So it's kind of a smaller scope than what I was trying to build. But they did it in such a realistic way that you could just absolutely imagine yourself being on one of these spaceships and facing all of the challenges with G-forces and stuff like that they have. And I found that fascinating, because you contrast that with some other science fiction where they just kind of hand-wavy, well, we'll kind of ignore physics and inertia and, other, things that you kind of be like, well, that feels a little weird. So I think what I took away from them was how to build a realistic space story without beating the reader over the head with it, and still maintaining a focus on the characters, which I thought was amazing. And the last is an author I've only recently started reading, Tamsin Muir, who wrote Gideon the Ninth, which I think might actually be my favorite book of all time right now. Most of it has to do with her. The story is absolutely amazing. I think she's so creative. Necromancers in space. It's just hilarious. But what really took me about her was her writing style. Every single sentence is a masterpiece. And the way that she uses her language, and the way that she uses words she'll use it in a very unconventional way, but that makes absolute sense. And it was maybe the only book I've ever read where I wanted to go back and read each sentence 2 or 3 times just because I wanted to absorb it. And I thought it was just absolutely so clever. So, I try in some ways to emulate that in Enigma with, clever turns of phrase and really just keeping the prose itself interesting, without becoming tiresome. The feedback's been great. One of my beta readers, I got an email from her saying something like, well, I haven't slept, I haven't eaten, I basically fell asleep at my desk for 48 hours straight because I could not put your book down. She said, shame on you. highest compliment I think I could ever receive. It's been really heartening. I think they love the protagonist. They really love Britta. So for the Lost Colonies series, I'm already kind of noodling the next book in the series. I've started imagining what the next plot can be. I haven't actually written anything down yet, so the next step for that will be, fortunately I think I'm already, the fun part for me as an author with a second book is that I already know the characters, I already know the world. It's a faster process to create the plot and really kind of move forward with it. So I'm already looking forward to that process. So that'll probably be starting soon. In the meantime, there's another series I haven't finished, the Timeless Keeper saga. So I've already started on book 3, which I think will be the final book in that series. I haven't named it yet. So most likely I'll finish that before I move on to the next book in the Lost Colonies series. And finally, there's another standalone science fiction book that I want to write. Again, had kind of this flash of inspiration that came to me, and I ended up plotting. I actually plotted the entire thing out, and it's ready to go. So that's in the queue. We'll see where that fits, but that should be a nice, fun standalone science fiction story. The story explores a couple of stereotypes, and I think Britta and her friend, who's really kind of like a sister to her, Crystal, are two polar opposites. So Britta is kind of like the outgoing extrovert, life of the party, brings light to every room that she walks in, and Crystal is kind of the stereotypical, locks herself in the lab, eccentric genius, doesn't get along well with people. And so, but their relationship, they've been basically best friends for their entire life. But it's created kind of, there's a synergy between them, but there's also kind of like a dependency that they've created on each other. And so, how that plays into the plot is they get separated by a tragic event that happens, and they end up having to kind of go off and do their own thing for the first time. And so part of what they have to overcome is doing these challenges, these things that they've always relied on the other person to do, but kind of having to rise to the occasion in their own way, each with their own challenges and their own gaps and things like that. But it also, I think the relationship helps drive the narrative, and it helps drive the characters forward. Especially, Crystal at one point, she thinks Britta's dead. And so there's a real drive for her, like a real personal drive for her to accomplish what she needs to accomplish, not only for the colonies, but maybe to help her friend. Britta was fun. She challenges a couple of stereotypes, I think. One is kind of the I want to say like the rich girl entitled aspect of it. So she's someone who kind of grew up in that, but she still has kind of like the will of the, I want to say like the greater good in her. So she wants to make a difference. She doesn't want to be what everybody thinks she is, and what she is in a lot of ways. She's also from a physical standpoint, so she's what would you call it, an endomorph. So she's tall and skinny, and to look at her, she almost looks anorexic, right? She's like emaciated and stuff like that, but she's very healthy. Like, she works out. She one of her pastimes is practicing with fighting sticks and things like that, which might come into the story a little bit later. And so it's kind of like her fighting some of the stereotypes that are against her, where people just, they look at her and they just assume she's frail, and it's like, well, you should probably eat something. And she's like, no, I'm fine. And it's just kind of this assumption, she repeatedly faces this assumption that, when something happens or when she survives something, because she is in shape, or because she was displayed ingenuity or something like that, they always assume it was some sort of divine intervention or some sort of luck or something like that, and said, well, couldn't it just be her skill and her perseverance that really enabled her to overcome this obstacle? So that was kind of a fun stereotype to play with. The other is Crystal, who's more of a stereotypical, it is kind of like a stereotypical engineer, and locks herself away in the lab. But she's also, like everybody, she's multifaceted, right? She doesn't like interacting with people, but if she has to, she can. And so the story puts her in situations where she has to go way outside of her comfort zone and really kind of take charge and become more than she ever thought she could. But she does it in her own way. And so what I like about the book is, and I think maybe a lot of engineers or introverted or introverts who read it might identify with her struggles, and hopefully find courage from how she gets around it. As a writer, when you're creating a story, it's about conflict. It's about struggle and survival. Well, not always survival, but usually struggle. Right? Could be emotional struggle, could be physical struggle, could be whatever. But oftentimes it's the struggle that makes us want to root for somebody, right? And so when I was imagining the story, it was, you think like riches to rags. It's like, okay, somebody who has had, riches to rags is somebody who has fallen. And the question is like, okay, how far can they fall? And I think when I was writing Enigma, it was fun because, the protagonist falls in several senses. She falls from orbit down to a planet, right? And that's a struggle in itself. She falls because she loses the technology that she's used to and the conveniences that she's used to, and she ends up in an environment where she has absolutely none of that. And it's a challenge to basically to even survive. She falls physically, so she gets into some altercations and stuff like that really challenge her physically, and actually ended up changing the course of the book in ways that even I hadn't imagined. She falls from a physical sense. The situation that led to those circumstances starts putting everything that she built. She sees her alliance, the Lost Colonies alliance, which is kind of her passion. She can see it crumbling apart with this one event. And so for her, it ends up being a struggle, not just a struggle for physical survival, but a struggle on 4 or 5 different fronts, where, the very first one is just getting through the day, like getting oxygen, trying to get to a point where she can actually stand up, right? The next is, trying to worry about, okay, well, how do I, great, I survived the last 5 minutes. How do I survive the next hour? How do I survive the next day? And doing so in an environment that she's absolutely not used to. She has none of the skills that are necessary to do what she needs to. And also, and a lot of it ends up her also, coming to grips with her own mortality. She ends up realizing that, there's a pretty short timer on her life, but there's something very, very important that she has to do. And so she has to do some really strict and really deep soul-searching prioritization to figure out what's important for her, and then of course how she's going to get it done, and get it done given all of the things that are in her way. And so to me, I look at the things that the protagonist goes through, and it's inspiring on so many levels, because I think, we maybe all of us would like to think if we were in that situation we would rise to the occasion like she did, but I think she does it in a way that I think is realistic enough that it could give a lot of people hope, and I think that's one of the coolest things. My first piece of advice is don't give up your day job. Writing is traditionally it's not only is it a low-paying profession, unless you happen to be one of the lucky ones who hits. It is a very, very competitive market. It's flooded, and it takes perseverance. I think too many authors, you spend years writing a book, especially if it's your first book. My first book took me 5 years to get to the point where I think it was publishable. But it takes a long time to get that book, and when you do, that's your baby. You've put so much time into it. I think many authors, including me, you can't imagine why people wouldn't love it, right? So you assume that you write this one book and it's going to be a hit, and it's going to get you the fame and the glamour and the income, and you'll be able to quit your day job and become a full-time author. And usually nothing could be further from the truth. Many authors who publish their first books, they're lucky if they sell a dozen copies, so they're lucky if they make enough to buy coffee in the United States. So, so in a lot of cases, for writers, it really has to be your passion. You have to really enjoy it, to stick with it, because if you're doing it for the money, you're going to be disappointed. It's going to be a very long, hard, disappointing road, usually. Again, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, that's how it goes. So, for example, my first book, I had never written anything. I think this was around 2010, I think. So I had never written anything before. I don't have an English degree or anything like that. And but I had done a lot of role playing when I was younger, Dungeons and Dragons. I had run games and stuff like that. So I had a lot of experience with building unique characters and with character interactions and building interesting worlds and things like that, and constructing plots that are interesting. So there are a lot of storytelling elements in role playing, and so I felt like I always had that in me, but I'd never really thought about writing a book. And then one day my wife, bless her, recommended a book to me, and she said, "Oh yeah, this is pretty good." And I started reading it, and I was cringing at some of the prose and the grammar, and the characters felt very cardboard. And actually I thought to myself, it's like, gosh, I think I could do better than this. And so I sat down, and it took me, I think it was 2 years. I was writing the book for 2 years before I even told anybody that I was writing it. And I finally got to the end. I finally got the courage to tell somebody that I was writing it, and put it in front of a couple of friends, and they read it, and the response was, it's okay. in truth, I don't really care about the protagonist. The story is okay. It's like, and that was heartbreaking. You put that much time into something, and it was crushing. But it was absolutely what I needed to hear. I know one friend in particular had a really hard time giving me that feedback, and I thank him up and down that he had the courage to do that. Because what I did was I went back and I found an editor. I found some outside help. I went back and I tore the plot to pieces. I reanalyzed everything. I wrote all of the characters out. I redid their personalities. I made their background. I fleshed out their backgrounds. I gave them a lot more depth. And I went back through and I rewrote every single line of that book. I don't think there was a single sentence that wasn't touched. And in the end, the interesting thing was it ended up being the same story, but and yet completely different from the original. And when I took that, really kind of like that same plot, but with these new characters and these new depth, and with their new depth and their new interactions, and I put it in front of people, suddenly people were like, oh yeah, okay, this is pretty good. But that was another year or two it took me to actually do that. So there's a level of perseverance in there, right? Because I was teaching myself how to write, and how to write something that somebody else wants to read, how to tell a story. And then from there, it was great. It got much easier. So for my journey, like the second book took me 6 months, much faster. And, I think the third book, a little longer than that, but I ended up splitting it into 3 books. So I think I got a lot of mileage out of that. It became much easier. I didn't have to do nearly as many revisions. I've, got it down to the point where for most part I can do probably 4 drafts and the book is ready to publish. But that's practice.